From the moment she walked into the music academy, people looked at her like she didn't belong. She carried an old, faded bag with worn-out sheet papers sticking out, and her quiet way of moving made some students smirk the moment she passed them. They whispered to each other, not even trying to hide it. They assumed she was a beginner who somehow entered the wrong building. Maybe they thought she was lost. Maybe they thought she was just another hopeful person who would give up after one or two failed attempts. But she didn't say a word back. She simply kept walking, holding her bag close to her chest like it was the only thing she trusted. She had come to the academy for auditions, something she had dreamed about for years but never had the courage to do. The academy was well known for its strict standards. Most people who auditioned never made it through the first round. The halls were filled with confident students wearing expensive clothes and carrying shiny new instruments. She, on the other hand, walked in with a second-hand notebook and a heart full of quiet determination. When she reached the waiting area, almost every seat was taken. People were warming up, practicing scales, and talking loudly about their experience, their private tutors, or the competitions they had already won. She sat in an empty corner, not wanting to disturb anyone. She took out her small notebook, which looked older than she was, and flipped through the pages. They were filled with tiny handwritten notes, scribbles, and finger position reminders. Anyone who looked at it would never guess the amount of time and effort behind those markings. A few students noticed her and exchanged amused glances. One of them even leaned toward his friend and whispered loud enough for her to hear, "Who comes to an audition with a notebook like that? She looks like she's here to learn her first lesson." His friend laughed, shaking his head. She heard every word, but she didn't react. She never reacted to those kinds of comments, not because she didn't feel anything, but because she had learned that sometimes silence is stronger than defending yourself. While she waited, she kept reminding herself why she was there. She remembered the little room where she used to practice every day. A room so small that when she stretched her arms too far, her fingers touched the walls. She remembered practicing late at night while the rest of the world slept, repeating the same passage again and again until it sounded right. She remembered the sacrifices she made, giving up time with friends, skipping outings, missing family gatherings just so she could spend more time practicing. And she remembered her dream, the one she had carried since she was young, to play her music on a real stage, in front of people who would listen, not judge. Her hands were cold from nervousness, but her heart was steady. She knew she didn't look impressive. She didn't have fancy clothes or a famous teacher backing her. But she had one thing that no one in that room knew. She had lived through moments that taught her how to keep going when everything felt impossible. She wasn't just there to audition. She was there to prove to herself that she belonged. The door to the audition room opened, and a woman stepped out with a clipboard. She called the next name, and the room went silent for a moment. The boy who had been practicing loudly moments earlier stood up with an overconfident smile and strutted into the room. The door closed behind him, and everyone returned to their warm-ups and conversations. Minutes passed, and one by one more names were called. Each person walked into the room full of hope and walked out with mixed expressions, some relieved, some disappointed, some trying to hide their frustration. Every time the door opened, she felt her heart race a little faster. Her palms grew slightly sweaty, and she wiped them on her jeans. Then finally, her name was called. The room fell strangely quiet. Even the students who had been whispering earlier stopped for a moment and glanced at her. She took a deep breath, picked up her notebook, and walked toward the door. She could feel eyes following her steps, some curious, some doubtful, some already convinced that she would fail. But she kept her gaze forward. Inside the audition room, everything felt bigger and brighter. The lights were strong, the room was spacious, and in the center of it all sat a grand piano that looked almost too perfect to touch. On the other side of the room sat the panel of judges, including the Academy's Maestro, a man known for his strict, almost cold manner. He rarely smiled. People said he could tell within the first 10 seconds whether someone had real talent or not. As she stepped forward, the Maestro looked her over her simple clothes, her old notebook, her nervous steps. He didn't say anything, but she could feel the judgment in the air. It wasn't cruel. It was the kind of judgment that came from years of seeing people try and fail. To him, she probably looked like just another beginner who didn't know what she was stepping into. "Name?" a judge asked. She answered softly, her voice slightly shaky. "What will you be performing today?" another judge asked. She told them. And for a moment, the maestro raised his eyebrows, not because he recognized the piece, but because it was a difficult one. Something advanced. Something no beginner would attempt. It was a piece she had practiced over and over again until she knew every breath, every pause, every soft note hidden inside it. "Proceed," Maestro said. She sat down at the piano, placing her notebook gently beside her. She didn't need it to play. She kept it there like a reminder of the journey that brought her to this moment. Her fingers hovered above the keys, and for a few seconds, she just breathed. She tried to calm the storm inside her chest, the nervous rush that made her want to jump up and run. But she stayed. She placed her fingers on the keys, closed her eyes for one heartbeat, and then began to play. The first note was soft, almost like a whisper. But the moment it filled the room, something strange happened. The judges who had been ready to mark her performance mechanically suddenly paused. The maestro's expression, usually stiff, softened a little. Her touch on the keys was calm, controlled, and full of emotion. It didn't sound like someone forcing themselves to play. It sounded like someone who lived inside the music. She played the next few measures with a flow that surprised even herself. All the doubts she had heard outside the room faded away. All the whispers, the looks, the laughter, everything disappeared as she lost herself completely in the music. Her fingers danced across the keys with confidence she didn't show outside the room. Every note carried a piece of her journey, her quiet struggles, and her hidden fire. While she played, the maestro leaned slightly forward. He wasn't expecting this. He had seen countless performers over the years, but something in her playing felt raw and honest. It wasn't perfect in a technical sense. It was better. It was real. She continued playing, unaware of how the room had changed. For her, nothing existed beyond the keys and the sound flowing from them. She was living the moment she had dreamed of for years. And even though the audition had just begun, one thing had already changed. The room that once felt intimidating now felt like the only place she belonged. By the time she reached the middle of the piece, she wasn't nervous anymore. She felt free, like every part of her life had led her to this exact second. She didn't know how the judges were reacting. She didn't care. All she knew was that she was doing what she loved more than anything else in the world. She hit the last note gently, letting it fade naturally into the air. And then, slowly, she lifted her hands from the keys. But she didn't turn around yet. She just sat there, breathing quietly, waiting for the world to return to her. For a moment after the last note faded, there was complete silence in the room. Not the uncomfortable kind of silence, but the kind that happens when people are trying to understand what they just experienced. She kept her eyes on the piano keys, afraid to look up, afraid to see disappointment or confusion on the judges' faces. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. Her hands were still shaking a little, but not from fear anymore. It was the kind of shaking that came from releasing something she had held inside for so long. When she finally lifted her gaze, she noticed something she didn't expect at all. The judges were not writing anything. They weren't whispering to each other. They weren't signaling for the next performer. They were simply staring at her as if they were seeing something they didn't know how to describe. And sitting in the center, the maestro had a look on his face she would have never imagined. He looked almost frozen. He wasn't blinking. His hands were still. He was just watching her with an expression that held both surprise and something like curiosity. It was the first time she saw him like that. She had heard stories about him, how strict he was, how many talented performers he had rejected without hesitation, how rarely he showed emotion. But the man sitting in front of her now didn't look cold or strict. He looked like someone witnessing something more than music. "You may rest your hands," one of the judges finally said quietly, almost as if he didn't want to break the air in the room. She nodded slightly and placed her hands gently in her lap. The maestro leaned back slowly, still staring at her. It felt strange, almost unreal. She wanted to ask if she had done something wrong, but she didn't dare to speak. She kept waiting, unsure of what would happen next. Another judge cleared his throat and finally broke the silence. "How long have you been playing?" he asked. She swallowed before answering. "Since I was young," she said softly. "But mostly, I practiced on my own." "On your own?" The judge repeated, exchanging a brief glance with another panel member. She nodded again. She didn't know how to explain everything, how she practiced on an old keyboard with missing keys, how she learned by listening to recordings again and again, how she spent hours reading free sheet music online because she couldn't afford classes. She didn't want to make excuses or look like she was begging for sympathy. So she simply said, yes. The maestro finally spoke, his voice deeper and calmer than she expected. "Who taught you the expression you just played with?" For the first time since entering the room, her eyes lifted fully to meet his. "Life, I guess," she whispered. The maestro blinked once, slowly, as if the answer had caught him off guard. The other judges watched him carefully, waiting to see what he would say next. He folded his hands on the table. "Do you understand the level of difficulty of the piece you chose?" "Yes," she said. "And yet you still chose it?" She nodded. "It was the only piece that made sense to me. It wasn't pride. It wasn't arrogance. It was the truth. That piece had helped her through some of the hardest times of her life. It made her feel understood in a way nothing else did. She didn't pick it because she wanted to impress anyone. She picked it because it felt like a part of her." The maestro studied her face for a moment longer. Then he turned to the other judges. They leaned slightly toward each other, whispering in low voices she couldn't hear. She waited, her heart pounding again. Her fingers kept brushing the side of her worn-out notebook, almost like touching something familiar to keep herself grounded. After a minute, the maestro lifted his hand slightly and the room went quiet again. "Play another one," he said. She blinked. "Another piece." "Yes," he replied. "Something of your choice." She hesitated, her mind racing. She came prepared for one piece, not two. She had practiced for months for the first one, but she could not say no. She had come too far to back down now. She took a slow breath and placed her fingers on the keys again. This time, she didn't overthink. She didn't worry about whether it was perfect or difficult or impressive. She simply played something that felt natural to her, something she had composed herself. It was a simple melody, nothing grand or dramatic, but it was hers. It came from quiet nights, from moments when she didn't know who to talk to, from times when music was the only place she could put her emotions. She had never played it for anyone before. It wasn't something she thought was good enough to show. But when her fingers started moving, she felt a comfort she hadn't felt since entering the building. The room grew still once more. The melody was soft, almost like a conversation between her and the instrument. It wasn't perfect. Sometimes her fingers hesitated slightly, but the emotion behind each note was unmistakable. Halfway through, she glanced up quickly, just enough to see the maestro again. He wasn't frozen this time. He was leaning slightly forward, listening so carefully it almost startled her. His eyes weren't cold. They weren't judging. They were moved. By the time she reached the last note, her heart felt oddly calm. She had opened a part of herself she had never shown to anyone, and now she waited for judgment, unsure if she should feel proud or scared. She lifted her fingers slowly, letting the sound fade. The room stayed silent for several seconds. Finally, one of the judges exhaled softly, like someone who had been holding their breath. "Who taught you to compose?" he asked. "No one," she said. "I just tried." The maestro's voice came next, quiet but firm. "Do you write your music down?" She nodded and gently tapped her notebook beside her. "Some of it? Not all? May I see it?" he asked, her breath caught. No one had ever asked to see her notebook before. She hesitated for a moment, then stood up and brought it to him. She placed it on the table, half expecting him to look at the messy handwriting and dismiss it immediately. But he didn't do that. Instead, he opened it slowly, as if it were something fragile. He looked at the scribbled notes, the corrections, the arrows pointing to specific bars, the little reminders she wrote to herself, like softer here. Don't rush, or remember the story. His eyes didn't show judgment. They showed interest. This is quite detailed, he murmured. It's just how I remember things, she said quietly. He didn't respond immediately. He closed the notebook carefully and placed it on the table. Then he looked at her. Not the way a strict teacher looks at a student, but the way someone looks at something unexpected and rare. He said her name, slowly, firmly. You have something most students spend years trying to find. She blinked, unsure how to respond. He continued, you have honesty in your playing. Not technique alone. Not perfection. Honesty. She wasn't sure what to say. She had never been praised like this before. She had never even imagined hearing something like that from someone like him. Another judge nodded. There is depth in your expression. It's clear you feel the music, not just play it. She felt her chest tighten, not from fear, but from something warm and overwhelming. She didn't want to cry in front of them, so she bit the inside of her cheek gently to keep herself steady. The maestro raised his hand slightly, signaling for silence again. Then he said something she'd never expected. Leave the room for a few minutes. We will call you back. Her heart dropped. For a second, she thought it meant something bad. But she didn't ask questions. She simply nodded and walked out. As she stepped into the hallway, the other students turned to look at her. Some looked curious. Some looked annoyed. Some looked like they didn't understand why she took so long inside. She found an empty chair and sat down. Her hands clasped tightly. She didn't know what the judges were discussing behind that closed door. She didn't know whether they saw potential or mistakes. She didn't know whether the maestro's silence was a good sign or a bad one. All she knew was that she had played with everything she had inside her. And now, all she could do was wait. Part 3 will continue from here. She sat in the hallway with her hands pressed together tightly, trying to stop them from shaking. It didn't help much. Her heart was beating so loudly she felt like others around her could probably hear it. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, not wanting to look at anyone, not wanting to wonder what they were thinking about her. Some students were still whispering, and she could feel their eyes on her, but she pretended not to notice. The hallway felt colder now. The excitement she felt a few minutes ago had faded, replaced by a nervous heaviness in her chest. She had no idea what was happening inside that room. She didn't know whether the judges were impressed, or confused, or disappointed. She didn't know if the maestro was considering giving her a chance or if he was simply shocked that a girl who looked like a beginner dared to play at his academy. She tried to take slow breaths. She kept replaying the performance in her head, trying to remember if she missed a note rushed apart, or made a mistake she didn't catch. But the truth was, she had been so lost in the music that she couldn't remember every detail. She only remembered how she felt like she had poured her entire heart into the keys. She tried to remind herself that this was more than she ever expected. Just standing in front of that piano, just playing in front of the maestro, was something she had dreamed about for years. Whatever happened next, she had already done something she never believed she could do, but still her heartbeat wouldn't calm down. Minutes passed, then more minutes. Every time the door clicked, she lifted her head slightly, thinking it might be the judges calling her back. But each time it was someone else. Students coming out of other rooms, teachers walking by, staff carrying papers. Nothing connected to her. She sat so still that her legs started to feel numb. She rubbed her hands together to warm them. Her fingers felt stiff, as if they had spent all their energy inside that audition room. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, the door to the audition room opened. The same woman with the clipboard stepped out. She looked around the hallway and then said her name. Her heart jumped. She stood quickly, almost too quickly, and her knees wobbled for a second. She steadied herself and walked toward the door. Her breath caught halfway, and she had to force herself to take another one. She stepped inside, and the room felt even bigger than before. The judges were still seated. The maestro was still in the center, his expression unreadable. She couldn't tell if that was good or bad. The woman closed the door behind her, leaving her alone with the panel again. For a moment, no one spoke. She felt like she should say something, maybe thank them for letting her play, or apologize if she had done anything wrong. But her mouth wouldn't open. She waited. The judge sitting on the left finally cleared his throat. "We discussed your performance," he said carefully. His tone didn't reveal whether the discussion had been positive or negative. She nodded quietly. "We listened to both your prepared piece and your original composition," another judge said. Folding his arms again, she nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Then the maestro leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. His voice was calm, but carried a weight. That filled the room. "You surprised us," he said. The words hit her so. Suddenly, she straightened a little. "You walked in looking like someone who had just started," he continued, not unkindly. "Someone unsure of herself. Someone not ready for this level." She lowered her eyes slightly, feeling a sting inside her chest. She knew that's how she looked. She knew she didn't fit the image of the students who usually auditioned here. "But then you played." She looked up again slowly. "And what you played," he said, "did not match what we saw when you entered that room." He paused, letting the silence settle again. "Your technique needs guidance," he continued honestly. "Your posture, your control, your transitions, these will need work."
Ow.
She felt her heart sink a little, but she kept listening. "But your emotion, your connection to the music, that is something we cannot teach." She didn't breathe for a second. She didn't blink. She didn't move. Another judge spoke next. "Many students come here with perfect training, perfect posture, perfect scales, but very few come with a voice. You have a voice." Her eyes softened, confusion mixing with disbelief. No one had ever said something like that to her. "And your second piece," the judge added gently, "the one you composed yourself. That was not the work of someone who only imitates. That was the work of someone who feels deeply." She wanted to smile, or maybe cry, or maybe do both. But she kept her expression controlled. The maestro leaned back slowly in his chair. "We do not accept many people each year," he said, "and we have rejected individuals with far more experience." She swallowed hard again. She could feel her pulse everywhere in her fingertips, in her neck, in her chest. Then he continued, "But talent does not always come dressed in confidence." Her breath caught. "Sometimes it arrives quietly," he said. "Sometimes it looks uncertain. Sometimes it looks like someone carrying an old notebook." Her eyes widened slightly. She couldn't believe he remembered that detail. The maestro lifted the notebook gently from the table. He held it for a moment, tapping it lightly with his fingers. "What you have here," he said, "is the beginning of something real, and we do not want to ignore that." She felt her heart slowly rising inside her chest. Hope was creeping in, piece by piece. Then the maestro placed the notebook back on the table and looked at her directly. "We want to offer you a place in the academy." She froze. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. She didn't blink. The words sounded unreal, like something from a dream she had repeated in her mind 1,000 times, but never expected to hear in reality. Another judge smiled softly. "It won't be easy," he said. "You will be working harder than most. You will need to unlearn some habits. You will need discipline. You will need confidence," the maestro added. "Not arrogance, confidence." She still couldn't respond. She felt something warm rising behind her eyes. She blinked quickly, trying to keep her vision from blurring. The maestro's tone softened, just slightly. "Do you accept?" She nodded. She couldn't trust her voice to speak yet. She nodded again, more firmly this time. "Yes," she whispered finally. "I accept." The judges exchanged small smiles. The maestro nodded once slowly, like someone confirming something important. "Good," he said. "Your journey begins today." She held her breath, unsure if she was allowed to feel this happy. She felt like collapsing into a chair or running out of the building and screaming with excitement. But she stayed calm, trying to accept the moment with the same quietness she entered with. "You may go now," the maestro said. "Training begins next week. Bring your notebook, and bring your determination." She nodded again and picked up her notebook with both hands. holding it carefully as if it had suddenly become even more precious. As she stepped out of the room, the hallway felt different. The same students who had whispered earlier looked at her with confusion. They didn't know what happened inside that room. They didn't know she had just been offered something she had feared and wished for at the same time. She walked slowly, her steps light, almost floating. She didn't care about the whispers anymore. She didn't care about the looks. All she cared about was that she had been seen, truly seen for the first time, and she knew this was only the beginning. When she walked out of the academy building that day, the world looked different to her. The sunlight felt warmer, the breeze felt softer, and the noise of the street didn't bother her the way it usually did. She kept replaying the Maestro's words in her mind, almost afraid they would fade away or suddenly feel unreal. But they didn't. They stayed with her, steady and powerful. She had been accepted. She whispered those words to herself as she walked home, most like she needed to hear them to believe them. I got in. She said it again, quietly, her voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and joy. I really got in. It felt strange to move through the city as if nothing had changed, while inside her, everything had shifted. She could feel the beginning of something new, something she had dreamt about but never told anyone. For so long, music had been something she practiced alone in her little room, something personal and fragile. Now, it was becoming something bigger, something the world might actually hear. When she reached home, she placed her notebook on the small table and sat on the edge of her bed. She looked around the room, the faded curtains, the chipped paint on the wall, the tiny keyboard in the corner with one broken key. This was where it had all begun. This little room had heard every mistake, every messy attempt, every soft whisper of late-night practice. She sat silently for a moment, letting the weight of everything settle. And then, slowly, her eyes filled with tears. Not the kind that came from sadness or frustration. These were warm tears, the kind that came from finally feeling seen. She didn't cry loudly. She simply let the tears fall one by one. While she held her notebook to her chest, eventually she wiped her face and took deep breaths, trying to steady herself. She knew the real challenge hadn't even begun yet. Getting accepted was only the first step. The academy was known for its demanding training. Students were expected to practice for hours every day, attend theory classes, rehearse with groups, and complete assignments that pushed their limits. But she wasn't scared. For the first time, she felt ready. The next week, she arrived at the academy early on the first day of training. The campus looked even larger than before, with tall buildings connected by long pathways, students rushing to classes, and the sound of instruments echoing through the halls. She felt small again, but not in the same way as before. This time, she felt small in a good way, like she was standing in a place filled with opportunity. She found her assigned classroom. Students were already sitting inside, some chatting, some warming up their fingers on the desk, some scrolling through their phones as if they already felt at home. She chose a seat near the back, not wanting to draw attention. A few students glanced at her, some with curiosity, others without interest. But no one whispered this time. No one laughed. Maybe they didn't see anything special in her, but at least they weren't dismissing her before she even touched the piano. When the maestro walked into the room, everyone straightened immediately. His presence carried a kind of authority that made people stop talking without him saying a word. He placed a stack of sheet papers on the table and looked around the room. We will begin with fundamentals, he said. Not because you are beginners, but because foundations matter more than you think. He distributed the sheets, walking past each student with quiet precision. When he reached her row, he paused for half a second, just long enough for their eyes to meet. The moment was small, but to her it felt meaningful. It felt like he remembered her audition, like he hadn't forgotten what he heard that day. The first lesson was intense. They practiced scales, arpeggios, finger strength exercises, and rhythm patterns. Her fingers felt sore halfway through, but she kept pushing. She didn't want to fall behind. She didn't want to disappoint anyone, not the maestro, not the judges, not herself. During a break, some students gathered near the window, talking about competitions they had entered before joining the academy. She listened quietly without joining, feeling a bit out of place. They talked about stage experiences, tutors, and travel. She had none of that. All she had was her old keyboard and her notebook. One girl with a confident voice laughed and said, "The maestro doesn't let anyone in unless they really impress him," another boy replied. "Yeah, he barely reacts to anything." The girl nodded. "If he ever looks surprised, that person is probably a genius." Hearing that made her chest warm a little. She didn't want to assume anything, but she remembered the way the maestro had looked at her during the audition, frozen, unmoving, silent. She wasn't a genius. She knew that, but maybe something in her playing had reached him. When the break ended, the maestro had them do pair exercises where two students practiced synchronization and timing. No one chose her at first. They partnered with people they already knew, forming little circles that didn't include her. She remained standing alone for a moment, unsure what to do. Then the maestro walked over and said her name, gently but firmly. "You will work with me today," he said. The room went silent for a second. A few students exchanged surprised looks. It wasn't common for the maestro to personally guide a beginner-level student. Usually, he worked with advanced performers. She nodded quietly, trying not to look nervous. They sat at the piano together. Her heart raced as she took her place beside him. He demonstrated a pattern with calm, controlled movements, then nodded for her to repeat it. She tried. Her fingers stumbled at first, missing the timing. She frowned, frustrated with herself. But instead of showing irritation, the maestro simply said, "Again." She played it again. "Slower," he instructed. She slowed down. "Now with breath. Feel the space between the notes." She tried again. "Better," he said. She felt a spark of relief. And something else, a growing determination. By the end of the session, she still hadn't perfected the exercise. But she had improved, little by little. She expected the maestro to move on quickly, maybe leave her to catch up alone. Instead, he stayed with her until the very last second, guiding her patiently. When class ended, students packed their bags and left the room. She gathered her things slowly, her hands still tingling from practice as she turned to leave. The maestro called out softly, "Wait." She stopped and looked at him. "You have emotion in your playing," he said. "But now you must learn discipline. Do not rely only on feeling. Feeling is a gift. Technique is a responsibility." She nodded, absorbing every word. "Bring your notebook tomorrow," he added. She blinked. "My notebook?" "Yes. I want to see more of your compositions." Her breath caught again, the same way it had in the audition room. She nodded quickly, unable to hide the tiny smile forming on her lips. The next few weeks were tough. Some days she felt exhausted. Some days she doubted herself. Some days she felt like she would never catch up to the others. But she kept going. Every night, she practiced until her fingertips tingled. She corrected her posture, her timing, her fingering. She worked on her reading speed. She learned to analyze pieces instead of just feeling them. Slowly, something changed. Her classmates started noticing her. Some asked her how she played such emotional pieces. Some asked if she could help them with rhythms or expression. She wasn't used to anyone asking her for help. But she tried her best. The maestro listened to her compositions during private sessions, giving her notes, pushing her to improve, encouraging her to experiment. His guidance was firm, sometimes strict, but never dismissive. He treated her like someone who deserved to be there one day. After a long practice session, the maestro said, "There will be a small performance at the end of the term. Each student will play something." Her breath tightened. "You will play your original composition," he said. She felt her throat tighten. My own piece." "Yes," he replied. "Your voice deserves to be heard." The night of the performance, she stood backstage with her notebook held tightly in her hands. She could hear the audience murmuring. She could hear students warming up. She could hear her own heartbeat. When her name was called, she walked onto the stage slowly, her palms sweating. The lights were warm on her face. The room was full students, families, teachers. She sat at the piano. The same feeling she had during her audition washed over her, the mix of fear, hope, and something deeper. She placed her fingers on the keys. And when she began to play, everything around her faded again. Her melody filled the room, soft at first, then stronger, flowing like a story only she could tell. She felt every note, every pause, every breath. The audience fell silent, and in the front row, the maestro watched her with that same expression he had during her audition still, focused, frozen by the honesty of her music. When the last note faded, the room remained quiet for a moment, then, slowly, applause began. Soft at first, then louder, then rising until the hall was filled with sound. She bowed her head, overwhelmed. She had never imagined she would hear applause meant for her. She had never imagined people would truly listen to her music. As she stood to leave the stage, she saw the maestro give a single nod. The kind of nod that meant more than any words. She walked off the stage with a steady heart. She had arrived at the academy as someone people underestimated. But now, she walked away as someone people believed in. And she knew, deep inside, that this was only the beginning of the life she had always dreamed of.